The Black Veil is a short story by Charles Dickens, published in February 1836. This Gothic British literature is from the perspective of an unnamed narrator. This horror mystery melodrama has macabre imagery and is set during the winter season in 1800 in London, England. In the early 19th century, the trade, politics, and the Industrial Revolution attracted rapid migration to London. Many new arrivals were poor migrants from the countryside looking for work, and most ended up in overcrowded slums. Most people in these poor districts could not read or write. Children were expected to earn money by working in factories, learning trades, or selling goods on the streets. Public hangings were banned in England in 1868. The West End became the center of wealthy life, while the East End and riverbank areas grew poorer and more crowded. By the late 18th century, the Black Veil took a significant role in mourning. It signaled a temporary withdrawal from public life and gave the mourner some privacy, hiding their grief from public scrutiny. The Black Veil was a performative acknowledgement of death's presence in life. It also marked the mourner as emotionally and socially vulnerable. On a cold, rainy winter evening around 1800, a young, newly established doctor relaxes by the fire, thinking about his future, patients, and the woman he loves. Half asleep, he dreams of her until a boy awakens him, announcing a visitor. To his surprise, a tall woman in mourning, her face hidden behind a black veil, stands at his door. She is soaked by rainwater and mentally distressed but insists she has come not for herself, but to seek urgent medical help for someone else in grave danger. The doctor, moved by her desperation, tries to calm her and persuade her to give him details so he can assist. She explains that intervention seems hopeless, but she can't leave the person to die. The doctor agrees to see the patient the next morning. Later, he can't stop thinking about the veiled woman and the sense of foreboding she carries. The next morning, the young surgeon travels to a poverty-stricken area of Walworth to visit the patient mentioned by the mysterious veiled woman he met the previous night. The neighborhood is bleak, with ruined cottages, muddy lanes, signs of poverty and neglect. Arriving at the patient's house, he finds a small, cold room where the woman leads him to her son, who lies motionless on the bed. The surgeon realizes that the man has been violently executed. The boy was hanged that morning for his crimes, leaving the mother distraught and mad with grief. Over time, the surgeon continues to care for her for many years, offering comfort and financial support. He cherishes her gratitude and prayers more than any of the professional honors he later receives. Let's thematically analyze the Black Veil. Grief appears as a storm, literal and figurative, that surrounds the characters from the opening scene to the final memory. From the moment the veiled woman appears, tall, immovable, soaked by the night rain, grief drives the plot towards its bleak revelation. The woman's behavior is marked by contradictions. She begs the surgeon to help a dying man, insists no help is possible, then forbids him from seeing the patient until morning. Her speech moves between desperation and resignation, certainty and confusion. She predicts death with uncanny accuracy, but refuses to allow intervention. The grief can trap individuals between action and paralysis, caught in the impossible desire to change the past and brace for its consequences. The veiled woman speaks of a dying man who is already dead, and the surgeon's expertise is demanded for a patient who cannot be helped. This confusion highlights grief's power to dislocate reality. Death has already taken place, but grief preserves the illusion that intervention remains possible. Grief becomes a force that suspends ordinary temporal order, keeping the dead within the living world and refusing closure until the truth is impossible to overlook. The environment is grief-stricken. The decaying houses, the dilapidated neighborhood, the ruinous lanes of Walworth, the dim rooms with their damp-stained walls, and the miserable patch of garden ground parallel the internal state of the veiled woman. The landscape seems soaked with rain and the woman's sorrow, like the grief isn't confined within individuals as it has seeped outward and discolored the world. The doctor learns that the dying man is already a corpse, recently hanged. The woman's son has been executed for criminal wrongdoing, so grief intertwines with guilt, shame, and social judgment. It becomes the grief of a mother whose love has not protected her child from the consequence of his actions. Her grief is for a son executed for criminal guilt. She grieves the loss of her son's life and the fruitlessness of the sacrifices to provide for her son. Grief intensifies because the object of maternal love is flawed. The mother's devotion, marked by years of self-imposed deprivation, collides with the moral implication of her son's crime. Her grief becomes a lifelong prison sentence that fractures her sanity. The woman's insanity becomes the final expression of grief carried past its limits. The surgeon's continued care for the mother after her madness reframes grief as an appeal for compassion. The mother's final lucid prayer becomes benediction that binds her suffering to the doctor's moral growth. Grief generates an ethical awakening in another character. The woman's veil is suggestive of grief's opacity. Grief is a curtain dropped between the woman and the world, and between the truth and the reader. Only when the veil is metaphorically lifted, when the son's death is revealed, does the doctor begin to understand the situation and the reason behind the woman's oddities. The surgeon's retrospective narration suggests grief's moral imprint. His memory of the woman, vivid years later, demonstrates that unshared grief can leave its mark on witnesses. Her suffering becomes part of his ethical formation, suggesting that grief generates a lingering influence that extends beyond the moment of loss. In The Black Veil, poverty operates like a secondary protagonist. The neighborhood the surgeon enters is described in terms that evoke decay, crumbling houses, unlit passages, and a landscape that seems to sag under its own deprivation. This setting suggests that poverty destroys spaces and hope. The woman's cottage is described as thin, neglected, and exhausted. The environment symbolizes that poverty invades the personal space and transforms the domestic space into a site of fragility rather than safety. The woman's veil serves as a marker of her economic and emotional marginality. In a society where poverty is often made visible and shamed, her attempt to conceal her identity reflects the moral burden the poor are forced to bear. Poverty becomes a form of social invisibility that erases individuals until crisis forces them briefly into view. Her son's trajectory into crime reflects poverty's capacity to distort moral agency. His criminal act of theft is born from desperation rather than inherent wickedness. He is not monstrously evil but a man driven by circumstances that squeezed his options to the point of misery. Instead of ritual, community, or consolation, the mother faces solitude, secrecy, and the slow erosion of her sanity. The story suggests that poverty isolates mourners, trapping them in private, unshared sorrow. From the surgeon's perspective, poverty induces fear and moral responsibility. His hesitation before entering the dilapidated neighborhood reflects a class-based anxiety. He fears the poor as desperate and potentially dangerous. By the end of the story, he is forced to see poverty as embodied human suffering. His memory of the event, years later, signals the lasting moral weight of witnessing poverty's consequences up close. The veiled woman's anonymity, the hidden identity of the dead son, and the closed-off world of the cottage reflect the cultural silencing of the poor. Their stories must be pried open, extracted through labor, fear, or accident. The mother's madness and son's death insists that poverty produces forms of suffering society often refuses to see until too late. Let's discuss the black veil's symbolism. The veil first appears as a literal object, obscuring the woman's face and, symbolically, her emotions and intentions. The deliberate concealment immediately positions the reader to perceive her as mysterious and authoritative. The veil amplifies her otherness and signals the presence of a psychological and emotional intensity. The concealment also establishes the story's tension, compelling the surgeon and the reader to question who she is, what she knows, and why she has come. At this moment, the veil operates as a protective boundary between private suffering and the intrusive gaze of public perception. The surgeon repeatedly attempts to discern the expression beneath the fabric, but its thickness rendered such a result impossible. The veil allows perception only in fragments, creating a liminal space between knowing and guessing. This tension indicates the woman's mental state. She is governed by grief, fear, and desperation, but must navigate the world of strangers to secure aid for her son. The act of removal signifies revelation and horror. When the curtain and the veil are finally drawn back, the surgeon confronts the physical and moral truth of the woman's tragedy. The black veil was now, for the first time, removed from her face, and the full impact of her son's death becomes evident. On one level, the unveiling exposes the literal consequences of crime and injustice, the murdered young man. While on a metaphorical level, the unveiling exposes the woman's grief, exhaustion, and the psychic toll of maternal care under conditions of extreme poverty. By hiding her face, the woman insulates herself from the immediate judgment and scrutiny of others, preserving a measure of autonomy over how her suffering is witnessed. When she attempts to prevent the surgeon from illuminating the room, the narrative suggests that suffering, associated with poverty and crime, is a spectacle fraught with moral responsibility. At the beginning, the story immerses the reader in literal darkness. The young surgeon sits by a cheerful fire, while outside the wind was beating the rain in pattering drops against the window, or rumbling dismally in the chimney. This external darkness parallels the internal uncertainty and anxiety of the surgeon and the story's mysterious female visitor. Darkness conveys isolation and vulnerability. The stormy night also heightens the Gothic tension, suggesting that what is hidden, grief, death, moral atrocity, can emerge suddenly and violently. In contrast, light is associated with revelation, perception, and moral discernment. When the surgeon confronts the scene of the murdered young man, the story emphasizes the role of illumination. Light exposes the violence inflicted on the victim and the depth of the mother's grief and trauma. Light functions as a mechanism of knowledge, cutting through concealment and forcing recognition of human suffering and injustice. The narrative links illumination to ethical awareness. Only by allowing light to fall on the scene can the surgeon understand the extent of the tragedy and respond appropriately. The woman's black veil and the drawn curtains sustain darkness, shielding her grief from public view and preserving a measure of privacy and agency. The exposure to light, whether the surgeon's scrutiny or the eventual revelation of the crime, forces confrontation with reality. The description of Walworth as a dreary waste, inhabited by a few scattered people of questionable character, emphasizes environmental darkness as a marker of social neglect and poverty. The dim, damp interiors of the houses convey the obscurity of marginalized lives, where suffering is often invisible to the wider world. Therefore, light also carries the potential to redress social blindness. When the surgeon brings illumination to the scene, he reveals a physical reality and asserts a moral and social responsibility toward the vulnerable and the suffering.